men are born free and equal in confronting disease which strikes without prejudice. For centuries, the medical world has considered the infirm human as a passive experimental subject, a guinea pig for scientific powers. (1885). Unable to perform tests, Louis Pasteur inoculates the young Joseph Meister against rabies, saving him from a terrible death. 1928. Alexander Fleming discovers penicillin, but refrains for some time before testing it on humans. 1941. Scientists carry out the first clinical trials. At the cost of numerous failures, some of them fatal, penicillin saves thousands of soldiers' lives. In 1945, the Allies are horrified to discover the Nazi camps, where doctors perpetrated experiments on prisoners quite blatantly treated like laboratory rats. At the Nuremberg trials, for the first time in history, doctors are accused of crimes against humanity.
The
trial gave rise to an extremely animated debate about how to establish the criteria used as a basis for evaluating whether a medical experiment is acceptable or not. Two camps emerged. One which said that basically, even if the Nazis perverted medicine, then medicine itself emerged from the affair unscathed. And the others who said, beware, Nazism revealed in the most horrendous way a fault, a danger, a threat that exists in every medical act and which may result in doctors abusing their powers over their patients.
The Allies justly condemned the excesses of Nazi medicine. Never again. And yet who would have believed that between 1932 and 1972 in Alabama, American doctors led experiments on 400 black, illiterate agricultural workers, all of whom had syphilis. The protocol claimed to differentiate between the syphilis of whites and that of blacks. For 40 years, the guinea pigs of Tuskegee were victims of lies. The nature of their disease was concealed. They were unwittingly deprived of treatment in order to provide a scientific foundation for the researchers' racist theories. Each case file was clearly marked. The study ends on the day of the autopsy. The Tuskegee scandal brought home a brutal truth. The Nazis are still with us. There was an urgent need for ethical legislation for clinical trials. France acted first in 1988.
Even then there were clinical trials, but the trials were carried out, and this is putting it mildly, without much transparency. There was the increasing suspicion that what we call human guinea pigs were involved, and the idea that it might be better not to go to hospital, or at least certain hospital departments, because experiments were being performed without the subjects being aware of it. So the essential element that stands as the basis of all clinical trials is the obligation to have the patient's free and enlightened consent.
Since the Huria law was introduced, the free and enlightened consent of the patient has to be established in writing, as explained by Dr. Mescalier from MDS Pharma, a private company running tests for a number of medical multinationals.
The doctor has to ask the question, do you accept to participate in these clinical tests or not? I can guarantee that they pose no problem for you and that you are an ideal target for this medication. And the patient then has to say yes or no, and if they say yes, they are asked to sign what we call the written consent. This written consent is about 2 pages long, which isn't very long. It explains everything that can be explained about the medication, everything that's known about it, the benefits, the side effects, and the risks, if there are any.
The drug validation procedure involves 3 stages. After initial experiments on animals, toxicity tests are carried out on healthy patients. Then the new drug is administered to a reduced number of sick patients. The effectiveness of the product is then compared to other existing molecules. This stage requires the recruitment of several hundred volunteers.
Produit qui est déjà préinscrit par l'ARS 169 et 193.
At the Curie Institute in Paris, various revolutionary cancer treatments are in the process of being validated. They are destined for patients for whom they are often the last glimmer of hope.
Once I've basically explained the ins and outs of the treatment, I give the patients a certain amount of time. I ask them to leave the consultation and go to the waiting room, to read the document with their partner, calmly, with a cup of coffee, and then we meet again, and they can ask questions about certain words or phrases they haven't understood, or things that aren't very clear.
In Mantes-la-Jolie, in Dr. Granier's infectious diseases department, new molecules are being tested on HIV patients. The mandatory signature at the bottom of the written consent depends largely on the rapport between the patients and their doctors.
It's
something that's rather particular, the case of clinical trials. You're totally free to say if you agree to get involved or if you don't want to get involved. The most important thing isn't the signature is merely a kind of authentication. But if it doesn't authenticate what has already been explained to the patients, which is necessarily oral, in an exchange between two people, then we're really well off the mark. I would also add, however, that we have to be very careful about what I would call the power of the medical authority. When we want someone to agree to participate in a protocol, the doctor has a formidable power. The patient is in a position of inferiority in this situation, and if we exploit the right arguments, even with the most honest intentions, then we're capable of persuading the vast majority of people.
Doctors who are aware of their power should therefore use persuasion rather than the force of authority. This essential diplomacy is not, however, self-evident. For certain so-called random trials, where lots are drawn, require that volunteers be divided into two groups or arms.
In this third phase, where we compare two treatments in order to eliminate any bias among the patient population, the volunteers are selected at random for one treatment or another. Usually this is done by computer, and it's often very difficult for the patients to accept, to see that there are two possible groups and that they will be in one or the other. Very often they ask us, "Doctor, tell us which is the best group. We want to be in that one. We want the best treatment."
The exercise of therapeutic trial protocols is very strictly controlled. Each different phase involves a case file that has to be examined and accepted beforehand by a national ethical commission. The validation procedure for a new drug is therefore extremely complex and requires both time and money.
In certain countries, it can involve 25 ethics committees, because if you have 25 doctors taking part in 25 different towns, there are 25 ethics committees, one committee per town. It's multiplied by 25, asking questions, waiting for answers, organizing committee meetings. All that causes delays. It can mean months. It means time. A delay of 1 month in the development of a drug, that is, in the final stages of development, can cost around $50 million. So there isn't a single pharmaceutical company, and it's understandable, they've been working on the product for maybe 10, 12 years, that wants to prolong the development.
Medical research in our countries today is also hampered by over-medication. It is difficult in France or the United States, for example, to find patients who have never received treatment. And a previously medicated patient makes a poor guinea pig.
Today, when someone in Mantes-la-Jolie has a fever and starts coughing, they go to see a doctor or visit the emergency ward of a hospital in the hours following the beginning of their pneumonia. Or if that's not the case, they'll immediately be given an antibiotic. Recruiting someone for clinical trials who has a well-documented pneumonia but who hasn't received antibiotics therefore becomes increasingly difficult. Carrying out clinical trials where there's a well-documented and clear-cut diagnosis is difficult. because the healthcare treatment process is so rapid and the use of antibiotics, which are necessary, is so rapid that it's not easy to include these people.
France is not an easy country for carrying out clinical trials, because the patient is king here. And it's true that they are somewhat more unpredictable and harder to find than in certain other countries where they're not treated nearly as well. In the United States, for example, patients pay for absolutely everything if they don't have insurance. We can estimate that 80 to 90% of costs are covered uniquely by the patient, and next to nothing is paid for by the state. It's clear, therefore, that patients are eager to participate in this kind of clinical test, because everything is paid for, they are looked after and treated and monitored, and that's worth a fortune, obviously.
A fortune indeed. The pharmaceutical industry is mining one of the richest resources of the century. Profits from a new antibiotic can reach billions of dollars a year. The enormous human potential of the Third World is therefore highly attractive for the medical multinationals. Patients in Tanzania, Myanmar and Madagascar will be tested for products destined for France, Germany and Canada. But are the ethical issues, more or less regulated in our countries, as clearly defined and respected far beyond our borders? The story takes place in Nigeria, a huge black African country with over 100 million inhabitants. Nigeria is a resource-rich country, a major oil producer, and could be prosperous. But a military dictatorship and corruption have led to ruin. In the federal capital, Lagos, the outcasts of economic growth lead a haphazard existence. Violence here is among the worst in the world, and wealth and poverty often coexist less than 100 meters apart. The dominant religion in Nigeria is Islam. The northern regions are dominated by Muslim doctors who apply the Sharia, Islamic law, and who are strongly anti-Western. It was in this context that a sinister clinical trials affair would erupt, with apparently disastrous consequences. In 1996, an epidemic of cerebrospinal meningitis broke out in the province of Kano, killing 16,000 children in just a few months. In March of that year, 4 researchers came to this isolated African region sent from the United States by the multinational giant Pfizer. They were to test, in a real-life emergency situation, a broad-spectrum antibiotic called Trovan. The dossier was almost complete, but back in the US, the laboratory was short of patients for the final trials on children. The meningitis epidemic in Nigeria provided a plentiful supply. The company was pressed for time. $1 billion a year was expected after the new drug was introduced onto the market. Pfizer set up shop here, not far from Doctors Without Borders, who were already treating thousands of children with tried and tested products. The American doctors selected 200 sick children. 100 would receive Trovan, 100 another well-known antibiotic. 3 weeks later, Pfizer decamped, taking their results with them. Trovan was soon launched in the United States, and the group reaped enormous profits. Scott Hopkins, the trial's director, was voted Man of the Year. 5 years later, the Washington Post launched an investigation in Nigeria. The Trovan success story was to become a scandal.
It was 7 years ago. My little boy was very sick, so I took him to the hospital. The white doctors there took him in. I don't know who they were. They told me that he would be well looked after. They took him to a special ward in the hospital where nobody was allowed to enter. I don't know what they did to him. I think they gave him an injection. I was very happy that he could get treatment for free, but I couldn't have imagined what would happen afterwards. They told us that it was over and that he could go home. But 2 days later, I had the impression that my son didn't react when we called him, and there was no sound that came from his mouth. He wasn't reacting when he touched or saw something. We gradually realized that he had become deaf and dumb. We were reduced to communicating with our hands.
The number of children cured but suffering after effects cannot be calculated. but the number of deaths is known. 11 children died. From the disease or from the drug. A nurse present in Kano at the time speaks of his young brother's final days and points an accusing finger.
My brother, my own brother, before he died, he has complication. He don't use his right hand, his leg, he can't walk, he can't talk. If you call him, he will not hear. Sometimes he will look like this. He even look like he cannot see properly. At the latter stage, he just passed urine, no control. He passed still no control. At the end, he died. So my brother died here because of the drug the father gave it to him.
Was Trovan toxic? This is certainly the case for Mr. Ishola, a lawyer in Kano who is defending a group of victims.
Even the medical literature of the drug is so clear that they should not use this drug for pediatrics. Yeah, it's there. This is the medical literature before me. I will show you. It's absolutely clear. I will read it out to you. One is, it says, the safety and effectiveness of trovafloxacin in pediatric patients and adolescents less than 18 years of age, pregnant women and nursing women have not been established. That is what the medical literature says. But lo and behold, because Nigerian kids are poor, because they are impoverished, because by sheer accident of life there was an epidemic, Pfizer felt they should capitalize on it and exploit the position of these innocent Nigerian children.
The doctors from abroad, it is said they came here to help us and to care for our children. But why didn't they stay at home and give this medicine to their own children? It is because they have no respect for us. They have destroyed our children. It is because they considered us like animals that they did this.
Did Trovan kill Nigerian children? It's impossible to confirm. Pfizer's Nigerian office has refused to give its version of the facts. The only certainty is that the rate of failure for Trovan was 6%, an apparently acceptable mortality level, not to mention the after effects.
The product itself, trovafloxacin, treated the meningococcal meningitis as well as the comparator, which, if my memory serves me well, was ceftriaxone, a third-generation antibiotic which was equally effective. The problem, the consequences and legal problems that arise are probably linked to the fact that it's been said that there were after effects. But meningococcal meningitis in these countries causes substantial after effects.
It is likely that in the context of a widespread epidemic, with often fatal consequences, Pfizer neglected the human and emotional dimension of the situation. A scientific researcher may be obsessed by results, but the patients are staking their lives. Dr. Gastello was coordinating the activities of Doctors Without Borders in Nigeria in 1996 and knows the meaning of emergency.
What is it that you cling to when you know you're going to die? And there's a molecule that can provide some hope. You cling to the word hope. You can take away all the rest. Everything is based on the discussion, on the confidence, on the way you speak and present the truth to people when you try to provide information. In Nigeria, of course, it was extremely difficult. The meningitis struck a lot of people and created a substantial psychosis. But I imagine that for the teams working there, the conditions were particularly difficult.
If it is likely that Trovan did not directly kill anyone in Nigeria, the somewhat offhand attitude of Pfizer explains the criticism. Certain parents had the feeling their children were unwittingly being used as guinea pigs.
It was unethical. It was not supposed to be carried that way. What they did, the Pfizer officials, was they collect the children, they took them inside an isolated area, inside a room, they treat them, they bring them out to the patient. They don't allow the patient to enter. Why should these people carry the victims, the children inside? Why is that they don't allow the parents to enter into that room? So that is why they felt somehow something was going wrong.
Pfizer didn't show us their drugs. We don't know their drugs. We don't even see the drugs. They just isolated themselves, do whatever they want to do and then pack and go.
They were accusing Pfizer of what the company did. They came, they tested their drug on human beings instead of doing that on animals. They did it on human beings. People considered it as inhuman. They were not happy.
Legal proceedings have been brought against the Pfizer Group, accused of not respecting international conventions regarding informed consent. Initiated in Nigeria, they are currently being continued in the United States. One of the victims' family spokesman is Zubairu Shaba, a human rights activist in Nigeria.
The clinical trial, the illegal clinical trial was conducted by Pfizer. And in fact, it was very, very, very barbaric. I can say it's very barbaric because we never thought this could happen in Nigeria. I never thought this type of thing could happen to our children in Nigeria. This cannot happen in Western countries. And because the clinical trial can never be conducted on a human being without formal approval and without their consent.
There was no consent, there was no education to the parents about the clinical trial. What these poor people felt they were receiving was humanitarian assistance. And you see, it beats me hollow when I realized later that they never got approval and they came here just to satisfy their own economic interest.
Pfizer claims that they obtained oral consent from the families through bilingual interpreters, even if they had no signatures on a written document. But did the families understand the information they were given? In Nigeria, the consensus is that they were deliberately misguided. In Paris, Dr. Tremoliere, member of an ethics commission, is doubtful.
I can't imagine that a major pharmaceutical firm would run the risk of tests causing an appalling catastrophe because of elementary ethical rules not being respected, whether in Nigeria or Bangladesh or wherever.
International conventions require the approval of an ethics commission for all clinical trials. In this particular case, what was the response of the Nigerian Ethics Commission?
We discovered that the Pfizer did not obtain the permission. So the Americano teaching hospital, which they say the ethics committee issued the permission, was not even existing at that time. There was nothing like ethics committee at that time. So the document they used was forged.
In one sun-drenched village, one man is waiting for justice to be done. His bitterness comes with the realization that the tragedy he has experienced is beyond his understanding. Manda Kojalawa places his fate in God's hands. He hopes that compensation may enable him to buy medication for his son, but he doesn't know that the after-effects of meningitis are irreversible.
I was so happy. At last someone was going to help us, because I don't have any money for a lawsuit and I don't have any money to cure my son. And otherwise my son is lost. He can no longer speak. He can't hear anymore. He will never be able to go to school. So maybe we can obtain something. We can get some money and pay for what we need.
But what has become of Trovan? Ironically, the miracle drug did not succeed as anticipated. Collateral damage from the treatment affected a market career that had such an auspicious beginning.
It was commercialized in the United States in 1998. After 1 year and almost 2.5 million prescriptions, 12 cases were reported, which led either to a death or a liver transplant. So the whole problem with this drug is that in our developed countries, the benefit-risk ratio of this new drug, which is nevertheless interesting, because of a few serious cases, has become undesirable. The authorization for its commercialization has been withdrawn in Europe and is extremely limited in the United States, which means that this medication's international career has been completely compromised.
How will the American courts respond to the accusations against Pfizer? The only light our investigation can shed on this sad affair is that clinical trials cannot be carried out with impunity in epidemic-stricken third world countries without taking extensive precautions and showing concern for the sensibilities of peoples only too willing to blame Western society. The Nigerian press vilified Pfizer. The streets of Kano were filled with demonstrators. Nigeria against Pfizer was the South against the North, the poor against the rich. For Pfizer, Nuruddin Kwajalawa is merely another number in experiment 154/149, for which the trial will soon begin in the United States. If all men are born equal in terms of disease, this is certainly not the case in terms of healthcare. So is the North-South divide, the poor against the rich, an inevitable scenario? Such a tragic medical research episode should surely put a stop to the northern countries' exploitation of Africans as fodder for their experiments. North and South are capable of establishing clinical trial protocols together, combining both scientific rigor and mutual respect. In Niakhar, east of Dakar, the French Institute for Research and Development is running tests covering the whole local public health domain. 40,000 people have been monitored here for over 40 years. The bulk of the research work concerns malaria and its frequency among the population. The ethical questions raised by the North-South divide are day-to-day concerns for researchers here.
L'acceptation scientifique d'un projet
That a project may be scientifically acceptable doesn't mean that it is ethically acceptable. And ethics always have the last word. We have a duty to protect the people we employ in our research. And to do that, wherever an ethical issue is in doubt, a project is rejected and sent back to the authors so that they can take our reservations into account.
The authorities here do not make do with spurious, unofficial agreements on post-dated documents. The IRD has extensive experience in the country and has established high standards.
Consent must, at the very least, be identical to what is expected with a northern population. But on top of that, we have to impose a certain vigilance to be sure that the cultural expectations of the population are met.
Every morning, a technician travels from village to village to collect blood samples which will be used to establish the trial protocols. Each sample taken from a child requires the parents' consent. But is it possible to apply the rule of written consent to the letter in a region where most of the population is illiterate?
Cette acceptation.
The requirement is certainly a problem. Why? Because we're dealing with people who have a long oral tradition and who have a certain faith in mankind. Once you've discussed a problem together and are in agreement, for them that's quite enough. A piece of paper has no real purpose. On the contrary, it can introduce a certain doubt. People can ask themselves, I've given my agreement in front of the village chief, in front of the imam, so why am I asked to sign a piece of paper?
Consent is therefore oral, but how to be sure it is well informed?
There has to be someone who acts as a guarantee. That's the role of the witness, someone who can guarantee that information has been given, that it's been understood, and that agreement is accorded without any constraint.
The process for obtaining consent is therefore laborious. IRD personnel have to respect the social hierarchy in the Senegalese villages and to exploit every opportunity.
We involve the whole community. The people who influence opinion in a village are the women's associations, young people's associations, the village chief, the imam, and political leaders from the south of the region. We managed to solve the problems by organizing numerous meetings among the different communities and their opinion leaders.
A village chief gives a lengthy account of how the IRD project was implemented among his constituents. The drums ring out to call the people together. The youngsters have convinced their parents. And the imam has called upon the faithful to put their trust in the scientists. But are the rules not being bent here, when enlightened consent requires total freedom of decision? The Western world is fundamentally individualistic. An African village is not a collection of individuals. Peer pressure is very strong here. Everyone knows everything about everybody else. Personal conscience is dissolved in the collective conscience. Dr. Diallo, an IRD doctor in Niakhar, is not unaware of the contradictions.
Consent given on a family level doesn't just involve the family members. There are the people who live next door, like here as we speak. There are always people who'll come and see what's going on, and they can give their opinion too.
There are also other specifically African cultural factors that can influence the giving of enlightened consent.
In the beginning, I wasn't against them taking blood samples from my child. But Ernest, my husband, wasn't there. So I asked him to come back, but he didn't arrive, and I don't have the right to decide without my husband.
In the vast zone that the IRD has been studying for over 40 years, there is one pocket of resistance, one village that resists obstinately, an incident from 30 years ago having caused long-term distrust.
There was a child who was weak from malnutrition. As the village chief, I presented him to the IRD. I don't know which team it was. But the IRD told me that in that particular case they couldn't do anything and that I would have to find a way of taking the child to the dispensary. During the time it took to go to the dispensary, the child suffered some after effects. He got better but stayed deaf and dumb.
The village chief does not appear keen to welcome the French scientists. The spreading of such rumors poses a serious problem.
If we want to find a solution to this problem, I think we'll only get it by providing an ongoing explanation. That is to say, not just for the enlightened consent at the beginning of the study, where we explain the basic outline to the community and individually before the subjects give their consent. I think, as well as this, we need to have a permanent information exchange.
Our reticent village chief has more to say. When pushed, he reveals the real reasons for his refusal to participate. What practical interest is there in collaborating?
What I don't like in all that's being done here is that they come here, they're always asking us loads of questions, and we try to answer them correctly, but we don't see the point of it all. What's the benefit for us? What do we get out of it?
The secret is there. The Africans agree to cooperate with the clinical trial teams as long as they can see some tangible reward. Give and take. The solution is to create mutual exchange schemes between the poorer populations and the medical teams. Making their medical personnel and pharmacy available to the village is therefore part of the deal for IRD. For the isolated villagers will not give their consent without access to treatment.
The people of Niakhar come to see us, and when someone needs to be evacuated, we lend a car, either a car belonging to a scientist or someone passing through, to take them to the health center in Fati.
A protocol for the tests will only be accepted by the villagers if they are all treated for free.
All the children who are not included in this study for whatever reason, in view of the fact that we came here to see them, they benefit from the same advantages as those who participate, and so that involves total coverage from a medical point of view. Consent should not be a bargaining tool. The fact of receiving benefits should not determine the participation or not in the study.
The substantial healthcare resources made available to everyone convinced the majority to participate. The therapeutic trials now inspire wariness in only a few hardened recalcitrants. The representative of one young person's association is firmly convinced of the benefits.
I have a child who took part in the malaria protocol. If it had been up to me, I would have proposed more, but unfortunately they just took one.
The IRD pursues its clinical trials in Senegal with an undeniable ethical rigour. But at the same time, the local population has become dependent on them. For the inhabitants of Niakhar, the IRD is a social security service. The region is very poor, and the locals cannot afford to pay for health insurance.
Our millet stores are empty. Instead of filming me, maybe you should take me to Europe.
In a growing number of southern countries, pauperization is forcing all manner of deprived peoples into medical protocols. Is there not a risk of straining the ethical rules that are supposed to guide such research? For where does free consent play a part in a blatant survival situation? Stricken by an AIDS epidemic, Thailand is a medical emergency zone. All the health services working here have to integrate the explosive realities of HIV into their programs. More than 1 million Thais in a population of 60 million have contracted the virus. Over a third of them have already died. Consumer sex is a traditional social and cultural phenomenon. Far from the tourist trap brothels, an El Dorado for currency-hungry prostitutes of every gender, it is in sordid suburban backrooms that the epidemic is spreading. The married women of Thailand, often submissive and resigned, are infected by husbands who pay for sex as if they were buying a beer at the corner cafe. At Chonburi Hospital, the infectious diseases department receives several hundred patients every day. In Dr. Jurirat's surgery, there is an endless line where every social class and category is represented.
And her CD4 is very low, only 4. Unfortunately, she got the infection from her husband who have already died last 3 or 4 years ago. She has a problem that her family did not accept her. And no one take care of her right now. She has to take care of herself by earn some money of maybe less than 2,000 baht a month.
AIDS is a social tragedy. Treating the sick is a therapeutic nightmare. A vicious adversary, the virus mutates constantly and resists all medication. Dr. Jurirat is working at Chonburi Hospital in collaboration with Dr. Philippe Seur, a French doctor living in Pattaya.
His name is Sorapan, he's 39, and his problem is AIDS, with multiple opportunistic infections. The meningitis has a fungus called Cryptococcus. The tuberculosis is being disseminated with another microbacteria that we call MAC. And there's yet another which is developing in the eye on the right. This is a multiple challenge because of the multiple infections, and on top of that, there's the interaction of the drugs among themselves. It's very tough.
We should not forget that AIDS today is not being cured. The virus can be blocked with combination therapy. But once someone is infected, they have to continue the treatment throughout their lives. Survival depends on being able to pay for medication. as patients wait for other more effective and cheaper drugs to be developed.
In every 7 minutes, Thai AIDS patient died. And because of the terrible price of the medicine, so it needs a fight to how to access to the treatment.
For the more desperate cases, deprived of any treatment, the only means of staying alive is a slim chance of taking part in clinical trials.
If you want some very expensive drug, the doctor have to find other resource to pay for this or to support this. So the research work is the only one way that we can do that.
Thailand is making every effort to attain the level of the leading industrialized nations and to gain sanitary independence. Amidst the futuristic high-rises here is the HIV-NAT Foundation, with its offices in the basement of an old water tower. It is working exclusively on developing protocols against AIDS for various governmental organizations and pharmaceutical multinationals. Its president, Dr. Prafan Phanuphat, is determined to carry out research worthy of the highest international standards and is unwilling to leave ethical questions to Western doctors.
I know that many professors, especially in the US, try to set up double standards for ethical approvals. To me, it's not acceptable. It should be the same ethical standard for throughout the world, no matter how poor you are or how rich you are.
Nevertheless, one can perhaps question the value of consent, however enlightened it may be, when the urgency of the context borders on panic.
In Thailand, it's a little bit different than developed countries because patients don't have options. And when you ask them for consent, you really have to be quite, you have to really look out for them because sometimes they would consent because they don't have other options outside clinical trials.
When taking part in trials represents the only chance for survival, what happens when the tests come to an end? If nothing is done to continue the treatment, death is inevitable. HIV-NAT is therefore careful that its patients are not sacrificial guinea pigs, deprived of healthcare after the tests. The drug companies are committed to supplying medication for 2 years after the protocol is concluded. Beyond these 2 years, HIV-NAT enters the patients in other protocols. When that is not possible, the organization finances 50% of the treatment. The patient has to provide the rest. Until today, not a single patient has been deprived of treatment. But this race against time cannot endure indefinitely.
Once these people, i.e. the investigators, the patients, are doing good things for the country because they save the country some money during the time that they have the free treatment, the country should also provide some help once the trial ends. Especially what I'm talking about is post-trial medications, post-trial treatment, which sometimes can be expensive. And governments should, stand up and say they should be responsible or should partially be responsible for this treatment after the trials, rather than, in many cases, after treatment, the patient would not have any follow-up treatment, which is, to me, is also an ethical issue.
Whether they are funded by HIV-NAT or the Thai social security system, the number of patients is only a few hundred, whereas the HIV-positive population in Thailand is hundreds of thousands. Without resources, without information, they are ready to listen to anyone. Certain criminal businessmen have passed off food complements as miracle drugs. Without any testing, scientific support or studies, thousands of doses of V1 immuniter were distributed. Ethical issues bow to profits. Wednesday Friends, an HIV support association, has attempted to counter this sinister enterprise with information campaigns.
I have heard about V1, and some of my friends have taken it, but I don't like the idea. I read in a book that it's just vitamins. It's not a real therapy. Apparently they just tested it on shrimps before giving it to people. One of my friends took it and he died.
In view of the epidemic, Thailand cannot refuse any demonstrations of goodwill. Philippe Sir has created a non-governmental organisation that is merely tolerated by the Health Ministry. He acts independently, funded uniquely by benefactors he has brought back to life.
What's important is that there's a diversion catheter which goes from the brain to the stomach. It's to divert the pressure in the brain caused by meningeal tuberculosis that is resisting medication. It was touch and go for him.
This small-scale operation functions thanks to gifts of drugs or small subsidies that Dr. Sir gathers with tireless persistence. A former Navy officer, he gave everything up with a single aim in mind: keeping alive those who have no one else as a last resort against death.
Just today I've started 2 new combination therapies. We were talking about access to the treatment because the cost of the treatment is 4,000 baht and he can only pay 1,000 a month. So that's where we have to help. If there's no one to help him, he has no treatment and he'll die. The ones we help, they can go back to work and give a bit more money. It's all about helping, that's all. We're helping. And it works.
This French doctor's devotion is certainly laudable, but he cannot combat AIDS single-handed. Thailand is striving to find solutions on a par with its public health ambitions, even if they have to flaunt convention. At the Chameleon Centre, a charity organisation takes in HIV-positive orphans. As she watched these orphans die, Krisana Kraisintu became acutely aware of the healthcare injustice afflicting the Thais. As a pharmacy research worker for the GPO, a state organisation, she tackled the problem head-on.
Thailand is a poor country and we cannot afford the treatment. $60 per person per month or 800 is too much for Thailand. We have something else to spend. So how can we put all the budget for the health in the health sector? So for me, my approach is that to bring the price down as low as possible.
Krisana copied molecules commercialized by various multinationals who had omitted to submit patents for Thailand. She thus developed GPO-VIR, a generic combination therapy. And in view of the urgency of the situation, she made it available to patients for just $20 a month, without the precautionary constraints imposed by Western science. Over commerce, royalties and scientific prudence, Krisana privileges the right to life.
Once you are born in this world, you have to do something good to the world. Otherwise you die and you don't do anything at all. I feel that my life is just like a boat. It's burning all the time. So what is left is the things that I do for others.
In terms of ethics and technology, the South is seeking to vie with the North in the medical research field. Perhaps it will succeed, but will it necessarily follow the same path? What is to be gained in doing so? Medical ethics and their immediate interpretation in the form of enlightened consent for patients have existed for less than 30 years. Created in the North, these ethical notions have travelled the globe and seem to be taking root. But how much slower, alas, is a universal extension of the right to decent healthcare, or even more basically, of the right to survive? One woman in Thailand has understood this. As her country attempts to resist the onslaught of AIDS, Krisana Krysintu is already facing another battleground on a whole other level. For her, ethics is also, and above all, about human commitment.
My dream is for everybody, for the poor people to get access to the treatment. And of course, one of my challenging dreams is to manufacture drug in Africa. It is a long-term solution. So this is the reason that I left Thailand for Africa. I want to have local production there. I want to transfer technology that I have to those people. That's my dream in life.
You